When my father passed away, the grief didn't come all at once. It crept in quietly, like a fog, settling into every corner of my life. He had always been a private man, quiet but firm, the kind of presence that filled a room without making much noise. After the funeral, I found myself back in his study, a place I hadn't been allowed to explore much growing up. It smelled like old paper, tobacco, and something faintly metallic. His books were still neatly arranged, and his desk drawers locked, just as they had always been. I spent days cleaning, sorting, opening drawers and boxes filled with memories I didn't know existed. Letters from colleagues, faded photographs, old receipts and appointment books. Everything pointed to the man I thought I knew, the man who raised me. But one thing stood out: a large, heavy safe hidden behind a false wall in his closet. It was the kind of thing you only see in movies, solid and cold to the touch, with a combination lock and no keyhole. For a few days, I avoided it. I wasn't sure if I wanted to know what he had locked away so tightly. But curiosity has a way of turning into obsession. I searched through every notebook, every drawer, every piece of paper in that study until finally, I found a torn envelope inside one of his books, with numbers scribbled on the back. I held my breath as I dialed them in. The lock clicked. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a thick stack of folders, an old revolver, a watch I'd never seen before, and a small wooden box. My heart pounded. I picked up the top folder and opened it. Inside were documents that didn't make sense, names I didn't recognize, places I had never heard my father mention, receipts from cities he never told us he visited. The revolver was loaded. The wooden box contained several old photographs of a woman I'd never seen before, standing beside my father, smiling as if they had shared a life together. I felt like I had stepped into someone else's story. None of it matched the father I had known. I sat on the floor of his study, folders spread out around me, photographs scattered like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. There were passports too. Not just his, but two more. Different names, different birth dates. My father had lived lives I never knew about, and now every moment I had spent with him felt like it needed to be questioned. Who had he really been? And why had he hidden it all? That night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, going over every conversation, every trip, every childhood memory. I wanted to believe there was a simple explanation, a hidden mission, an undercover job, something noble, but part of me feared the truth would be much darker. The documents hinted at something more complex, something dangerous. I needed to know more. I needed to understand the man I had buried, and the secrets he had taken with him to the grave. So I made a plan. I would go through everything piece by piece. I would track down every name, every location, every fragment of the life he had hidden. And I would find the truth no matter what it cost me. The next morning, I returned to the study, a notebook and pen in hand, determined to document everything. The safe's contents were still laid out where I'd left them. I started with the photographs. Most were black and white, some in color, all aged and curling at the edges. The woman in them appeared often, sometimes beside my father, sometimes alone. There was something intimate in the way he looked at her in those pictures, a kind of softness I had never seen in him. In one photo, they stood on a beach, arms around each other, wind in their hair. On the back, in faded ink, was written, Marseille, 1979.
Marseille?
He had never mentioned France, or travel, really. My father had always presented himself as a man who stayed close to home, worked hard, and kept life simple. But now I was looking at undeniable proof that there had been another side to him, one filled with places, people, and stories that he had deliberately kept from us. I opened the next folder. It contained a series of letters, typed on thin paper, dated over a span of years. They weren't addressed to anyone directly. Instead, they read like reports, dry, factual, precise. Mentions of surveillance, coded references to transactions, even notes on individuals that sounded more like targets than friends. Was he involved in intelligence work? Organized crime? My hands trembled slightly as I read. One letter stood out. It referenced a name that matched one of the passports. A name that wasn't my father's, at least not the one I knew. I began to make connections between the documents, slowly mapping out the pieces. It seemed like he had lived at least 2 separate lives, possibly more. In another folder there were medical records. Not his, or at least not all his. One document listed a blood type that didn't match his known medical files. Another showed a surgery performed in a clinic in Argentina. There were x-rays, prescriptions, and a typed referral note signed by a doctor whose name I didn't recognize. Why had he kept all this? And who did it all belong to? At the bottom of the safe was a small, leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with handwritten notes, some in English, some in French, others in a language I didn't immediately recognize. It was part diary, part cipher. One page caught my eye. A line scrawled across it read, "The boy must never know." I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Was that about me? Or someone else? Who was the boy? The more I uncovered, the more questions flooded my mind. What had started as a discovery had turned into a full-blown unraveling of everything I believed. I spent hours reading, cross-referencing, translating what I could. The deeper I went, the clearer it became that my father had been part of something vast and hidden. He had operated under aliases, traveled under different identities. He had secrets buried in cities across the world. And he had gone to great lengths to ensure that no one, not even his family, ever found out. But now I had found it all. And I couldn't stop. Because somewhere in these pages was the truth about who my father really was. And maybe, just maybe, who I really was too. The following days blurred together. I hardly left the study. Meals were forgotten. Calls went unanswered. I was consumed by the quiet storm of revelations that kept pouring from the documents and artifacts my father had hidden. Every page I turned deepened the mystery. Every photo, every note, every receipt was a breadcrumb along a trail that led further from the man I thought I knew and deeper into the shadow of someone else entirely. I focused next on the passports. There were 3. One was in his real name, or at least the name I had always known. The other 2 bore different names, both foreign. One American, one Swiss. The photos were unmistakably him, but he looked different in each, slightly altered hairstyles, expressions, even posture. The details in these documents weren't casual. They were expertly crafted identities, complete with work visas, tax IDs, and travel stamps dating back decades. I spread the documents across the floor, arranging them in a loose timeline. Argentina, France, Morocco, Hong Kong, and Berlin. He had traveled more than I ever knew. During years he claimed to be buried in office work. Some trips aligned with historical events, moments of tension in global politics. There were connections here, patterns I couldn't yet fully understand, but they felt deliberate, calculated. I returned to the leather-bound journal, hoping it might unlock more. His handwriting varied, sharp and efficient in some places, almost frantic in others. Certain pages seemed to reference covert operations, contacts, and movements. The word "rook" appeared frequently, capitalized, surrounded by circles or underlines. At first, I assumed it was a name, but as I cross-referenced more notes, I began to suspect it was a code name. Perhaps his. One journal entry stood out among the rest. It mentioned a specific date and coordinates. I input them into an online map and was surprised to find it led to a remote village in Eastern Europe, a place I had never heard of. Next to the coordinates was a phrase in French, which roughly translated to, "Everything begins and ends here." That night, I lay in bed clutching the journal, my mind racing. Who had my father truly been? A spy? A double agent? A man running from his past? Or from himself? The implications were dizzying. But more than that, I felt a growing sense of urgency. As though now that I knew this much, I couldn't let it sit dormant. I had inherited something the moment I opened that safe. Not just knowledge, responsibility. I began to research names, places, code names. Some references led to obscure articles, declassified intelligence documents, and even conspiracy forums. It was hard to separate truth from fiction. But there was one name that kept appearing, always tied to operations in Cold War-era Europe, always linked to silence and disappearance. The name was mine, my surname, Not my father's first name, but the family name we shared. That sent a shiver down my spine. Had I been part of this story all along without knowing it? Was I a shadow in a larger play, groomed without my consent, shaped by a man who had orchestrated every detail of our lives with precision? Or was I just collateral, the unintended heir to a life of lies? I didn't know yet, but I was going to find out. And the next step was clear. I had to go to the place marked in the journal. The coordinates in Eastern Europe. I booked the flight the next morning. The flight to Eastern Europe was uneventful, but my mind was anything but calm. I had printed out every document, photocopied the pages of the journal, and packed it all carefully in a secure folder. I didn't know what I was expecting to find in a remote village pinned by coordinates scrawled decades ago in my father's handwriting. But it felt inevitable, like the story had already chosen its course and I was simply following its script. The village, nestled between rolling hills and dense pine forests, seemed untouched by time. Cobblestone paths, chipped plaster walls, and smoke curling from chimneys gave the place a frozen, postcard-like feel. My arrival was quiet. No one seemed to notice me, or perhaps they just chose not to. I booked a small room at the only inn, its walls thick with history and silence. The coordinates led to an abandoned house on the outskirts of the village. Overgrown weeds covered the path. The windows were shattered, and the door hung from its rusted hinges. Inside, dust coated every surface, but the structure was intact. The fireplace still held the charred remains of its last use. In the back room, I found a broken wardrobe, and behind it, a false panel in the wall. My pulse quickened. Behind the panel was a compartment, and inside it a metal lockbox. No key, no code. I pried it open with a crowbar I had brought just in case. The contents inside stopped my breath. A series of envelopes, each labeled in my father's handwriting. One of them bore my name. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a letter, written in full, neat cursive. He had known I would come. He had anticipated this journey. The letter didn't explain everything. It wasn't a confession. It was more of a guide, urging me to look deeper, to go further. He wrote that if I had made it this far, I was ready. That not everything could be explained with words. Some truths, he said, had to be lived, experienced, and understood through action. He mentioned someone named Marek, a contact in the village who could help me. He gave no details, just a name. No address, no description. It was like trying to find a ghost in a place that didn't welcome questions. I asked the innkeeper if she knew anyone by that name. She looked at me for a long moment, then shook her head. That night, I lay awake in my room, staring at the ceiling, hearing every creak of the old building. The air smelled of smoke and pine. I clutched the letter, reading it again and again, trying to decode its subtext. My father had been here. He had stood in this room. He had hidden that lockbox with the knowledge that someday I would follow him. In the morning, I walked through the village again. I visited the market, the church, even the local pub. I asked the same question each time. Do you know Marek? Most people shrugged or claimed not to understand me. One man, older, with a cane and eyes that had seen too much, simply nodded and gestured toward the forest. I followed his silent direction, walking along a narrow trail that wound deeper into the woods. After an hour, I came to a small cottage nestled among the trees. Smoke rose from its chimney. I hesitated, heart pounding, and then knocked on the door. The man who answered was tall, lean, and weathered. His eyes were sharp, calculating. He said nothing, only looked at me for a long time before finally stepping aside and letting me in. He knew why I was there. He had been waiting too. Inside Marek's cottage, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and old paper. The walls were lined with shelves of books, folders, maps, and what looked like surveillance photographs pinned to corkboards. He didn't offer me tea or ask who I was. He simply pointed to a wooden chair near the fire and sat across from me. The silence between us stretched long enough to become something tangible. Then he slid a folder across the table toward me. My name was written on the front. Not in my father's handwriting, Marek's. He had prepared this for me. The contents were chilling. Reports, articles, copies of surveillance logs. But what froze me was the inclusion of recent photographs of me. At work, at home, even one taken just days before I found the safe. Someone had been watching me for a long time. Merrick finally spoke, his voice low and calm. He told me my father had not simply been a spy or a criminal. He had been both and neither. He operated in the gray, working for causes that were never fully clean. Sometimes he protected people. Other times he eliminated threats. He was part of a loose, nameless network, not quite government, not quite rogue, that existed in the cracks between power and ideology. My father had saved lives. He had also ended them. And what scared me most was how easily I believed it. The calm, distant man who raised me now appeared in my memory as someone layered with complexity, violence, and secrets. Merrick explained that the journal and the documents I had found were just fragments. There were other caches, other locations. My father had created a trail, not of breadcrumbs, but of keys. Each one opened a new door. Each door led to deeper truths. He handed me a small black envelope. Inside was a photograph. It was of me as a child, no older than 5, standing next to a man I didn't recognize. The back was labeled only with a date. Merrick watched my reaction carefully, then told me something that changed everything. The man in the photo wasn't just anyone. He was believed to be my biological father. My real father. The man I had buried may have raised me, but he had not given me life. That revelation shattered whatever was left of the floor beneath me. Merrick didn't elaborate. He said if I wanted answers, I had to keep going. He gave me a new folder, this one with an address in Berlin. He told me my father had spent years watching over me from the shadows, protecting me from truths I wasn't ready to know. But now the protections were gone. The truth was mine to chase or to bury again. There was no pressure, just the promise that, should I go further, I would never return the same. I left Marek's cottage just as dusk settled over the forest. The air had turned colder, the wind sharper. I walked back to the village in silence, holding the folder like it contained fire. I couldn't shake the image of that photograph, of the man beside the child that had been me. His eyes were dark and unfamiliar, his smile unreadable. Back in my room, I opened the folder again. The address in Berlin was clear. It was a storage unit, registered under one of my father's aliases. There was a key taped to the inside of the folder, old and rusted. I stared at it for a long time. I wasn't ready, but I knew I would go. I had to, because now this wasn't just about discovering who my father had been. It was about uncovering who I truly was. And something told me that Berlin held more than just documents and answers. It held the next chapter of a story I had only just begun to understand. Berlin was sharp-edged and fast, a city constantly in motion, yet full of shadows where the past lingered like old smoke. I arrived on a gray morning, the sky low and heavy. The storage unit was on the east side, tucked between a disused railway line and a mechanic's yard. The building itself was forgettable, concrete, aging, streaked with rust. It had the kind of anonymity my father would have appreciated. The key slid into the lock with surprising ease. I paused before opening the door, almost expecting an alarm, or worse. But there was only silence. Inside, the space was neat, almost surgical. Metal shelves lined the walls, filled with labeled boxes and file cases. In the center stood a single metal table, and on it, another envelope marked with my name. I opened it slowly. It was a continuation, a thread leading from Marek's cottage directly into this cold room. My father's handwriting filled the pages. He spoke of regrets, of decisions that had haunted him. But he also spoke of a mission, one that began long before I was born. He had been tasked with protecting something or someone whose identity had remained hidden even from his closest allies. And then came the next bombshell. My name had appeared in files long before I was even old enough to understand what secrecy meant. I had been part of the plan from the beginning, not just a bystander. There were suggestions that I had been moved, adopted, placed in his care for a purpose. He never said directly who had orchestrated it. But he left breadcrumbs, mentions of a program, a group referred to only by an acronym, Aegis. The pages hinted at genetic research, behavioral conditioning, intelligence grooming. It sounded like science fiction, felt like nightmare. My own childhood memories began to twist under the weight of implication. I dug deeper into the boxes. Each contained layers of documentation. Surveillance photos, handwritten notes, diagrams of unknown facilities, pages in languages I couldn't read. One file contained medical records, mine. Some I had never seen before. Tests I didn't remember taking. Biomarkers, psychological assessments. There were patterns of observation starting from the age of 3. I found a photograph, black and white, showing a group of children standing in front of a government building somewhere in Eastern Europe. One of the children was me. The others were unfamiliar. On the back of the photo was a date and a phrase, Phase 1, complete. My knees went weak. I sat on the cold floor, the photo trembling in my hand. Whatever my life had been, it wasn't what I believed. I wasn't simply the son of a secretive man. I had been watched, shaped, possibly even designed. The thought chilled me to my core. Then I found the final box. It was heavier than the others. Inside was a sealed package with a note attached, "Deliver only if compromised." It was addressed to someone I had never heard of, but it included coordinates, this time in Canada. I didn't know what compromised meant in this context. Was it a dead drop, a final contingency, or something far more dangerous? The more I uncovered, the less certain I became of the world I lived in. The letter concluded with one final message. If you've made it here, the next move is yours. Choose wisely. This story is no longer mine. It's yours now. I sat in that cold Berlin storage unit, surrounded by the evidence of a life I hadn't lived, realizing I stood at a crossroads. I could walk away, seal the boxes, forget the coordinates, return to a life of questions. Or I could follow the trail again, deeper into a web that might never fully reveal its center. But something inside me had already decided. I folded the map to Canada, tucked it into my coat, and walked out into the Berlin fog. The flight to Canada was long and quiet. I spent most of it staring at the map my father had left, the coordinates etched into my thoughts like scars. Every mile felt like a descent, not geographically but spiritually. I wasn't just chasing answers anymore. I was unraveling the very core of who I was, and every new truth burned away the old certainties. The location was remote, deep in the forests of British Columbia, miles from the nearest town. I rented a 4-wheel drive vehicle and followed the map's instructions until the paved road gave way to gravel, and eventually to a narrow dirt path that disappeared into the trees. The forest closed in around me, and for a moment I wondered if this was where the trail would end. Not with revelation, but with disappearance. Eventually I found the site. Hidden behind a thicket of pines was a low concrete structure, almost invisible from the road. No signs, no lights, just a rusted metal door, locked with a keypad. I entered the numbers scrawled on the edge of the map. The door clicked open. Inside was a small control room, long abandoned but intact. Dust covered the surfaces, but the equipment was preserved, wrapped in plastic. There were filing cabinets, computers powered down, maps pinned to the walls, and a smell of metal and mildew. In the center of the room, under a protective glass case, was another envelope. My name again. This one wasn't from my father. The handwriting was different. Inside was a letter dated 2 years ago, signed by someone named Elena. She claimed to have known me when I was very young, and the letter's tone was warm but cautious. She spoke of a project, of protocols that had been broken, of truths that had to be buried for safety. She also mentioned that if I had found the Berlin cache and come this far, then it meant the failsafe had been activated. Failsafe. The word echoed ominously. It suggested danger, urgency. She warned me not to trust everything I'd found, not even my father. According to her, he had grown unstable in the final years, paranoid, obsessed with rewriting the past. She said he had meant well, but had crossed lines that should never have been crossed. She included a photograph. It showed my father, older, worn, standing beside a much younger man, me, but it wasn't a picture I remembered ever taking. The timestamp on the back indicated it had been taken only 3 years earlier. I looked the same, but I had no memory of it. None. That's when the second package in the cabinet caught my eye. A hard drive, wrapped in foil with a sticky note. Play me. I took it back to my hotel and hooked it into a laptop. The files it contained were video logs,
Surveillance clip.
medical records, interviews, and near the end recordings of me, or someone who looked exactly like me, speaking, moving, smiling. But it wasn't me. I had no recollection of those moments. None. They were dated and labeled as Subject 17. My chest tightened. What did it mean? Had I been part of an experiment? Was I even who I thought I was? The last file was a recorded message. My father again, but different this time. He looked directly into the camera, his eyes tired, voice thin. He spoke of choices, of sacrifices made to protect something bigger than us both. He said he hadn't wanted this life for me, that he tried to shelter me from it. But it had found me anyway. Then he said it plainly, that I wasn't born in the way I believed, that I had been created, guided, shaped, and that there were others like me. The screen went black. I sat in the dark, surrounded by silence that felt like it stretched across time itself. This wasn't just about my father's secrets anymore. This was about the origin of my own life, and the idea that maybe I had never been free at all. The days after watching the video blurred together in a haze of disbelief. Couldn't eat. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face, heard his voice telling me I had been created, shaped. Subject 17. The label echoed in my thoughts like a brand. Who were the others? Where were they? And what exactly had we been created for? I spent hours going through the rest of the files on the hard drive. Most were encrypted, some corrupted. But a few opened, and what they revealed was staggering. Test results, genetic reports, neurological scans. My DNA wasn't ordinary. According to the files, I carried markers engineered for heightened cognition, advanced memory retention, and emotional regulation. The tests weren't dated recently. They began when I was a toddler. Elena had included another file in her letter, a document titled Containment Protocols. It described measures to monitor, restrict, and in some cases, terminate subjects deemed unstable or dangerous. My name appeared twice, once in a list of active monitored subjects, and once more later in red ink, status flagged elevated risk. I sat in the motel room in a state of paralysis. If I had been part of something this controlled, this calculated, had any of my choices ever been my own? Was I just a result of a lab experiment wrapped in the illusion of a normal life? It would have been easier to run, to disappear, leave the folders and hard drive behind and pretend none of it existed. But I couldn't. The truth had infected me. And the deeper it went, the more I needed to know, not just about myself, but about the people who had done this. I went back to the site the next day, hoping to find more. In the back of the building, behind a hidden panel, I discovered a narrow staircase leading underground. It was steep, cold, and dark, but I descended, flashlight in hand. The air was dense, metallic, thick with mold. At the bottom was a reinforced door, sealed tight. There was a biometric scanner beside it. A small red light blinked above the fingerprint pad. I hesitated, then pressed my thumb against it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft beep, the door slid open. The room beyond was sterile and silent. Rows of cabinets, containment units, observation windows. And in the center, a cryo chamber. Empty now, but clearly once active. The control panel beside it bore a familiar code. Subject 17. I walked the perimeter slowly, reading the logs still stored on the terminals. Subject 17 was listed as stable, compliant, high-functioning, capable of autonomy and deep integration into civilian populations. Purpose: unknown. Last accessed 4 years ago. There were no other names, no other subjects, only me. But then I found a door labeled Archives. Inside, there were shelves of physical files. And in one dusty box marked Obsolete Projects was a stack of folders labeled Subject 01 through Subject 16. each one with a red slash through the number. Terminated. Failed. Deceased. I felt the room tilt slightly. I had been the only one to survive. At the bottom of the box was a final file, subject 18. No photo. No notes. Just a single sentence typed on a page. Unaccounted for. Someone else was still out there. And suddenly I knew. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning of something much larger. Something buried so deep it had taken half a lifetime to surface. I wasn't just chasing my past anymore. I was being called into my future. I left the underground facility as the sun was rising, its light barely piercing the dense forest canopy. The air felt thinner now, heavier with the weight of what I had learned. I drove for hours without direction, stopping only when exhaustion forced me to pull over at a remote gas station, miles from anywhere. I sat in the car, staring at the dashboard, the folder marked subject 18 clutched in my hand. Unaccounted for. The phrase haunted me. Somewhere out there was another person like me. Someone who had either escaped the system or had never been fully pulled into it. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating. If they were alive, they might have answers I didn't. Or they might be running from the same questions that now followed me. I returned home, though it no longer felt like home. The walls of my apartment were still there, but the sense of safety was gone. I changed the locks, disabled every smart device, and moved files onto encrypted drives. I began tracking down anything connected to Aegis. Most searches came up empty, but a few obscure databases, declassified documents, and leaked files hinted at the existence of cognitive enhancement trials and genetic behavioral sculpting, terms that mirrored what I had seen in the Berlin and Canada archives. Then, an unexpected email arrived.
No sender.
No subject, just a line of text. If you want to know about subject 18, meet me in Reykjavik. Attached was a plane ticket. I hesitated for hours, pacing, questioning whether this was a trap. But I couldn't ignore it. My life had been rewritten too many times already. I needed to confront whatever waited on the other end. I flew out the next morning. Reykjavik greeted me with snow and silence. I followed the directions in the email to a quiet cafe on the edge of the city. Inside, near the back, sat a woman in a dark coat. She looked up as I approached, then nodded. I sat across from her, and for a moment, we simply stared at each other. She introduced herself as Vera. She claimed to have worked within Aegis until it was dismantled nearly a decade ago. She had been a handler, one of the few who maintained direct contact with the subjects. She didn't recognize me at first, she said, but once she saw the files had been accessed, she knew someone had survived. Vera told me that Subject 18 had been different from the others. More volatile, less predictable. They had gone off-grid after the final evaluation phase. Aegis had tried to recover them, but every attempt failed. After years of silence, their trace resurfaced. That was why Vera had reached out. She believed Subject 18 was active again. And not alone. She slid a folder across the table. Inside were surveillance photos, blurred images from various cities. Faces half hidden. A figure that might have been Subject 18 appearing across Europe, then Asia. There were notes about interactions with black market tech dealers, underground clinics, and groups labeled only as sympathizers. Vera warned me that Subject 18 might not be like me. That whatever we shared in creation, we did not share in direction. She believed 18 had a mission, one built on vengeance, on exposing everything. And if Aegis still had allies in the shadows, Subject 18 could start a chain reaction. I asked why she had told me all this. Why me? Why now? She said simply, because if 18 finds you first, there won't be a conversation. As I left the cafe, the snow had begun to fall harder. I looked down the quiet street and felt something shift. The hunter and the hunted. The created and the rogue. I didn't know which one I was anymore, but I knew what I had to do. Find Subject 18 before they found me. The final stretch began with silence.
No answers. No instructions.
Just the gnawing sense that I was being watched, tracked, or maybe even led. Every step I took felt pre-written, like the story had already been outlined and I was just catching up to the chapters already lived by someone else. I left Reykjavik the next morning with a new identity, forged papers, and a destination: Bucharest. Vera had included one last clue, a handwritten note at the bottom of the folder: seek the library, ask for the janitor. It sounded absurd, cryptic, maybe even a trap. But at this point, I had nothing left but paths made of riddles. The library was old, Gothic, tucked between faceless apartment blocks. Its high arched windows stared down like sentries. Inside, dust motes floated like ghosts between shelves of forgotten knowledge. I wandered through its aisles until I found a man pushing a cart of ancient volumes. He didn't ask who I was. He simply nodded once and turned, guiding me down a narrow corridor and through a service door into a hidden archive. There, he handed me a sealed box. No words, no questions. Then he turned and walked away. Inside the box were more photographs of me, of Subject 18, of facilities now destroyed, documents marked with seals I'd never seen before, and one last video stored on a small encrypted drive. I played it back in a hotel room with the curtains drawn and the lights off. The face that appeared on screen wasn't my father. It was Subject 18. They looked like me, eerily so. But their voice, their presence, their energy was different. Sharper, angrier. They spoke directly to the camera. To me, they said we were made to be mirrors, parallel experiments in divergent environments. I was raised with stability, education, a sense of safety. They were not. They had been tested, broken, and abandoned. Aegis had wanted to see how nature versus nurture would shape their ultimate creation. And now they were coming to end it all. Aegis, the handlers, the architects, the sympathizers, anyone who had a hand in it. They were building something, a second wave, a new generation. And Subject 18 had sworn to burn it down before it started again. They didn't threaten me, but they warned me. If I stood in their way, I'd become part of the wreckage. The video ended with one sentence: you were the control. I was the consequence. I sat in the dark for hours, thinking, remembering, realizing that every step I had taken had been carved from another's pain. I had always believed I was looking for the truth, but now I understood the truth had been looking for me. Couldn't run. Not anymore. So I prepared. I gathered everything: notes, names, locations. I mapped what I could. I reached out to old contacts my father had mentioned, to Vera again, to others who had vanished after Aegis fell. A quiet network came alive, whispering from the cracks. And finally I got a signal. A meeting point. One last place. Deep in the Carpathians, under a ruined monastery, I found what remained of the original lab. Subject 18 had already been there. The place was scorched, stripped, empty. But on a stone wall, scrawled in black ash, were 3 words: I remember everything. I stood in the cold, letting those words settle into my bones. This was no longer about answers. It was about reckoning, about choosing who I would be, not what I had been made to become. So I walked away from the ruins, into the blinding white of the mountains, not to hide, but to rebuild. My story didn't end with a revelation. It began with one, and I was finally free to write the rest myself.